This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, Dave Thompson, author of the Grunge Diaries, Seattle, 1990 to 1994. Throughout the 1990s, Dave Thompson was the Seattle-based contributing editor to Alternative Press magazine, America's biggest-selling and most influential alternative rock monthly, and a regular contributor to other publications both nationally and internationally. Throughout this decade, grunge music ruled the world, and Seattle was its birthplace and focal point. Thompson was an eyewitness to it all. His writings and interviews chronicled the entire history of grunge, from its roots in the earliest explosion of punk in the mid-1970s to its rise and ultimate fall from grace in the late 1990s. Drawing from Thompson's extensive experience and research, from personal files and journals and hours of interviews with both musicians and fans, other music industry figures, and a wealth of characters from the Seattle scene, the Grunge Diaries is an exhaustive account of this unique era. Featured are all of the major acts: Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Mudhoney, Soundgarden, and many lesser-known bands and artists. But it's not only about the music, the fashions, and the personalities that still resonate today. The Grunge Diaries also tells the tale of the end of an era in American history. 20th century music culture's last hurrah before the dot-com monsters, many of whom were themselves based in Seattle, devoured its soul and faceless corporations rebranded entertainment. These were the days when fame was still within reach of anyone who knew three chords and had three friends. Dave Thompson is the author of over 150 books, including co-written memoirs with New York Dolls Sylvain Sylvain, Motown legends Brian and Eddie Holland, Hawkwind's Nick Turner, the Yardbirds' Jim McCarty, Fairport Convention's Judy Dybel, and more. He's a columnist for Goldmine magazine, and his work has also appeared in Rolling Stone, Spin, Alternative Press, Mojo, Record Collector, and many other major publications. He's contributed to music documentaries produced by VH1, A&E, the BBC, and others. Born in the UK, Thompson is now a resident of Delaware. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Dave, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I love the final line in the book description. These were the days when fame was still within reach of anyone who knew three chords and had three friends. I was around 18, 19 during the early 90s, and that statement resonates so much with my generation, no matter where you're from. I was in college living in New Haven, Connecticut, and I remember it vividly experiencing that grunge movement almost overnight take over. And I think I told you this story through the email, but Nirvana played a tiny little club in New Haven called The Moon, which is now, I believe, a bank. And it was in New Haven, late September night, weeknight in 1991, maybe 100 people there. And that's up on YouTube for anyone who wants to see that. It is an amazing snapshot in time because in mere months, they would be huge. They were about to blow up. Smells Like Teen Spirit on the local rock station, the video. And then you had Pearl Jam's Alive video started to get a ton of play. And then at first, they were mixed in with the still popular 80s bands of the time, like Poison and Warrant. But eventually, those bands were obsolete, and it was all grunge rock. And you were there to document it all as it happened. Did you see that tidal wave coming, or were you surprised at just how huge the Seattle rock scene became?
Yes and no. I remember I reviewed Nevermind for Alternative Press, and this was before it came out. And one line that's always stuck with me was, one nudge in this band could be enormous. And I was quite proud of that afterwards.
Boy, you were right.
But I mean, I arrived there in 1991, and I'm slightly older than you. It reminded me a lot of London in the mid-70s in that there were just clubs everywhere and bands to fill them. The big difference was it was hard to put your finger on a Seattle scene or sound because every band was so different. The first two groups I interviewed out there, one was called Somebody's Daughter, who were essentially a folk rock group. And the other one was Mad Mad Nomad, who were this insane art rock group. And then every time I went out, because, being so older than I was when punk was around, I could afford to go to shows every night and get home from them. You could go to any show, but you'd never say, this is the Seattle sound. It was really only when it's really only when Nirvana came through that you actually realized that there was something. Because Alice were a heavy metal band, Soundgarden were a sort of heavy blues band. Nirvana spearheaded something different, and then you started to spot other bands who had obviously drunk the same wine as Nirvana.
And you're from the UK. You said you arrived there. So did you move to Seattle? Did you live in that area?
Yes. I came over from the UK, lived in Colorado for a while, and then moved to Seattle at the beginning of the 90s. And I was there for 15 years.
Was it for professional reasons, or was it personal reasons that you went there and it just happened to be that the scene blew up while you were there?
Again, a bit of both. I was in Colorado, and Colorado Springs, actually, and it wasn't the most exciting place from a sort of musical journalist point of view. Very pretty, but not very exciting. And somebody I was talking to said, I heard that there's a lot of bands in Seattle. And it was like, oh, maybe I should move there. It's like when you're younger, you just do these things very much spur of the moment. And it happened that somebody who worked in one of our local stores had grown up in Seattle. So it's like, what's it like? And he said, well, it's really great and it's really expensive. But he made it sound like superb. And I was so sick of mountains by that point that it's like, okay, Seattle still has mountains, but they're further away.
That's a move that paid off for you. You were right there at ground zero. As you write in the preface, this book is not just about the musical movement. It's a trip back in time to when we didn't rely on the internet for everything. It's about promoting through posters instead of social media. It's about comic books and not comic book movies. It really is a tale of the end of an era in American history.
That was the general idea when I started it. Is that I didn't just want to talk about Seattle music, because inevitably you're going to get sucked into the Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam axis. But there was just so much happening there on the art scene. As you mentioned, comics came in. Fantagraphics were my favorite publisher, regardless of the fact they were local. There was a thriving underground cinema scene. There was just so much going on. There were used bookshops everywhere. You could not, like coffee shops are now, you could not turn around without finding a used bookstore. And I love old books. So it was perfect. And the city was still, when I got there, I call it an Indian village or a logging town. That's kind of how it felt. You were stepping back into an undefined era where all the buildings were made of crumbly red brick and everybody knew one another, and there were just lots of places to go and lots of things to do.
When was the last time you've been there?
Left in 2005, by which time it was really funny. They went into a mad redevelopment phase, I guess early 2000s. And a friend came up to visit from Bogota, Colombia, and we were walking through downtown, and it was just before we moved. He stopped in the middle of the road, looked around and said, I am so glad you are leaving this slum. Because it looked terrible. It was, building sites and homeless and places falling apart. Apparently they've done a very nice job of sprucing it up since then, but I really have no interest in returning.
The book has a personal feel to it. You include daily entries throughout the years, concert events and album releases on a particular day, but also non-music related events just to put the reader in that moment. Just picking one randomly, Wednesday, October 31st, 1990. It says, tired of people dumping trash beneath the George Washington Bridge as it soars above Fremont, the local council commissioned 4 local artists to fill the gap with a monstrous concrete, metal, and mesh troll. I love those entries. How were you able to obtain these events, and what was the process in terms of putting them all together?
I have a very good archive, and I was pretty good at writing diaries through that period. It was really just going through old newspapers, old issues of the Rocket, which was the local one of the local music magazines. Then just sort of going online and important events in Seattle in 1991, and just the ones that I remembered and that I found interesting. There's a lot of references to the weather because we had some great storms. not like they have nowadays, but really good storms came through, and all the traffic lights would be out, and you couldn't go to see the Buzzcocks at the off ramp because there were no traffic lights between where I lived and there. Just things like that, things that stuck in my mind.
The common description of Seattle is it can rain for a long time, but then when it's nice, it is beautiful.
Yes. Yeah, that's very true. They have more nice days now, apparently. I've got a friend who lives out there, and he'll call every so often and say it's been 90 for the last 3 weeks. And it's like, wow, I don't ever remember it doing that. It always felt like we'd have a week of absolutely perfect warm weather, and then the clouds would return, and then the smog would return.
Because you read about how that atmosphere does affect the music that came out of that era. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, I say in the introduction that it was called the most livable city in America, but it was also the serial killer capital of America. There was it's going to sound sort of very woo-woo, but there was sort of an underlying darkness to the city that was also very, very attractive, I think, to a lot of people. A lot of the clubs were very old buildings. There was the Vogue, and I mentioned that it was haunted by the girls who used to work there. There were other places that had their own little legends and rumors, and I go into that quite a bit in the book. If there's a good Fortean sighting, I will mention it, like UFOs and things, because the first UFOs reported in this country and taken seriously were near Seattle.
I did not know that.
Yeah, they're the ones in 1947 over Mount Rainier. Then Bigfoot wanders around Washington State. There's a lot of that out there. In the 1900s, this woman opened a fasting clinic further south in Washington State, but her main office was in Seattle. She would invite or get the rich women who wanted to lose weight to sign up, and she'd take them to what was basically a camp in the woods and starve them to death. And yes, they would lose weight. And of course, she would collect. She would be in their will, and she had quite a good business out of it for a good few years. And things like that. I mean, every city, I believe, has its dark side, but in Seattle, it wasn't really hidden.
This leads me to the next question. The term grunge, it does seem to fit. You quote Kurt Cobain from an interview you did with him. He said, grunge isn't an attitude. It's not even music. It's a zip code. And I know there are many artists from the 80s who despise the hairband label because they felt it took away from their musical abilities of those artists. Do you think the term grunge was and is a fair one?
Musically, no. I think of grunge in the same way as I think of punk, that punk was an attitude, not a musical genre. But of course, once the mainstream media gets hold of something, it becomes, they're a punk band. It's like, no, they have a punk attitude, but they do not play the same as every other punk band. And grunge was the same, because I saw that applied to a lot of very inappropriate bands over the years. And it's like, no, they're not a grunge band. They're from Seattle. But grunge, if you take it to mean sort of dark and faintly unpleasant and a little smelly, that's really grungy, that fits. Because the city had, it had like this ooze to it.
Why do we need labels? The media puts a label on it, but also it's a marketing tool. There's something psychological there that we need to have a label on everything.
We have to, because otherwise it'd be like going into a supermarket and none of the cans say what's in them. And you just buy 20 random cans and hope you've got baked beans. It's the same way. You have to have something that people say, I like that grunge band, so I would like this one. I mean, when I first got to Seattle, I could have gone to see, I probably saw 10 bands before I saw one that would later fit the media description of grunge. But that was great because I never knew what I was going to get. But if I'd only wanted to see grunge bands, it would have been difficult, without the label. If I'd only wanted to see folk bands, it would have been difficult without the label.
Yeah, it's just inevitable. It has to be there, whether the artists like it or not. And I think the artists as a whole, I don't think they ever had an issue with grunge. Certainly not like the '80s artists. They go nuts whenever the radio stations will have a program called the hair band hour or.
Yes. Well, when you think about it, I mean, hair band and hair metal is actually very derogatory because it doesn't even have anything to do with the music. It's to do with their hairstyle. It's like glam rock as well. I mean, that gets applied to anyone who's sort of around in Britain in 72 to 74. And a lot of bands will sit there and scream, "We weren't glam rock." It's like, oh, actually, I was growing up then, and I kind of remember you as being that. Because, they fell into the pool of bands I liked, most of whom were glam rock.
Sure.
Yeah, so you have to have labels, because otherwise it's just going to be, they sound like REM, and so do they, and so do they, and so do they. And really, that's even worse.
Kurt Cobain, he became the figurehead for that Seattle grunge scene, a label he was never comfortable with. He's been described as a conflicted man. At times he wanted Nirvana to be the biggest band in the world, but also he had his struggles, as we know, with fame and seeing these kids who picked on him in high school. They're now showing up to his concerts. How did you find him to be? How often did you interview him? A few times, more than a few times? How many times did you interview him?
And I did one formal interview with him, and then we ran into one another on a semi-regular basis, so we knew one another.
Okay. How did you find him to be then?
He was a nice guy. After he died, there was a lot of people saying, he was conflicted, he was this, he was that. He didn't always come over that way. He came over like any musician who wants success, but they want it on their terms. And they're surrounded by people who will not allow that to happen, who will say, oh, you've got to do this, you've got to be interviewed by Sassy, you've got to do that. And, he'd rather be interviewed by, a fancy. So he was conflicted in as much as he didn't like the way the music industry works. But so were a lot of musicians. We never actually talked about his personal life and, all the things that came out again after he died. But he was not somebody who I had on my list of people likely to commit suicide in the garage.
Really?
No, not at all. I mean, the other thing, there was a lot of revision when he passed away. And I talk about this in the book. The first time Nirvana brought out or did an unplugged section in this show, it was at the New Music Seminar in New York. And the audience booed. It was like, play rock and roll. We don't, need this girl with a cello, blah, 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 boo, boo, boo. And they hated it. Yet, they did the unplugged, and I don't know if you remember, but reviews of that were not necessarily glowing. The people who liked it loved it, but a lot of people were like, well, that's not what Nirvana should sound like. After he died, of course, unplugged becomes the height of their career, because now you say, oh, doesn't he look vulnerable playing an acoustic guitar? And you can see the pain in his eyes. And it's like, you didn't say that at the time.
Did you know Courtney Love? Had you seen her around? Was she with him?
Oh, saw her around a lot. And again, I always liked her. There was the Courtney who was, I think of Courtney as, there were two Courtneys. There was the one who sort of went shopping and you'd run into in places and be, hi, hi. And then there was the one who was in the media who was really horrible. And she did it deliberately. But, she, I'm sure, was quite capable of being, lovely for a long period of time. But then you put a journalist in the room. Johnny Rotten was the same way.
Yeah.
You could be sitting talking to him and he would just be, John, who's got funny coloured hair. And then a journalist would walk in, like, hi, well, I'm interviewing you. And John, and just turn into this sort of foul-mouthed, nasty little monster. Journalist walks away. Oh, what were we talking about? You have a public image, and if you're good at it, people believe the public image is you. David Bowie with his whole gay spaceman thing, people actually believed he was a gay spaceman. But going back to sort of the revision of opinions about Nirvana on Unplugged, I saw it again when David Bowie died. He released his album, was it 2 or 3 days before the death was announced? And if you go back and read the first reviews published over that weekend, they're very, very different to the reviews that were published after his death was announced. Everybody who wrote after his death was announced, oh yeah, you can see that he's going to, you can see he knew he was dying. But nobody who reviewed it in the 2 days before he died, and I'm a big Bowie fan, so I read most of them. Nobody who reviewed it in the days before he died actually said, oh God, listening to this, I think he's going to die in a few days. Oh, this is really doomy. This is really fatalistic. Nobody spotted that. So Wise after the event is always a lovely thing.
Yeah. Seattle is, as you describe in the book, it's an isolated city. It's cut off from the rest of the world. And it wasn't the type of place musicians bragged about prior to the 90s. Heart's Nancy Wilson, as you write, once admitted that when her band started out in the mid-'70s, they insisted they were from Vancouver because, quote, it sounded more exotic than to say we were from Seattle. What was Seattle's music scene like prior to the late 80s and 90s when these bands started to take over?
Well, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But Bill Rieflin, the late Bill Rieflin, who was with Ministry through the 90s, he grew up there and had a few bands there in the punk days, and said there were bands, but there was not a scene as you would think of it. There were just bands who played, but there weren't many places to play. What happened really was just this perfect storm of clubs opening and bands forming at the late 80s. And, there's lots of reasons for it, which I talk about in the book. But really, it was just this wonderful synchronicity of time and place. And all of a sudden, there were just bands everywhere. My first week there, I picked up a copy of The Rocket and was just looking through the gig guide. And it's like, okay, I've not heard of any of these, but, there's a lot of them. And I just started going out. I tried to hit every club, at least once, more if I liked it, and just see, what was happening there. And then I started working for a couple of local magazines, and I'd rely on editors. Well, you like that lot, so maybe you'll like this lot. And bands made it by word of mouth because there were a lot of people going to a lot of clubs to see them.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the Rocket, the newspaper, and also those venues. Get to that in just a bit. The punk bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks, they were popular among the teens in Seattle. But then you did have the 70s metal bands like Aerosmith or Ted Nugent that were big too. The Melvins' Buzz Osborne talks about that in the book. And I always heard early era Aerosmith in that music. Another is Black Sabbath.
Oh, yeah.
Any other bands or artists that you picked up on from those days that they looked up to from the 70s or maybe the 80s?
I think in general it was punk and metal. And I think one of the beauties of Seattle being so isolated is that there was not that snobbishness of if you like punk, you can't like metal. I mean, again, in London in the late 70s, if you like the Sex Pistols, you damn well better hide your Black Sabbath albums if anyone visits. And the other band I think that had a big influence was Motorhead. They were actually a band that in Britain spanned they did manage to do the punk metal crossover because they were around at the time. They were noisier than any other band you'd ever seen. First time I saw them, which was the original lineup in like 75, I could not believe this was actually a band that was allowed to play. They were so loud, so fast, so rough.
High energy, in your face.
Totally, yeah.
And real. Lemmy was the real deal. I think Lemmy would be the guy who, whether the media was there or not, he was that way all the time.
Oh, yeah, he was.
Did you ever meet him or interview him?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Motorhead and I go back a long way.
Cool. Kurt Cobain was a fan of those bands, too. I read that the first concert he ever attended was a Sammy Hagar show in Seattle, but he revised that story, said it was actually a Black Flag concert. Is that true?
That I don't know. But he could. I mean, he would like those bands. You know, he was born in the late '60s, so he'd have been a teenager for the end of the '70s, or moving into his teens, end of the '70s, early '80s, and that's where you find the music you like. And you know that was all contemporary. So yeah, he's going to like them.
I think he liked Kiss too. They did a cover of "Do You Love Me." There's a demo
Yeah.
of that out there.
Well, you know, as is now well known, you listen to "Smells Like Teen Spirit," and you know, hiding in the back of it, you can hear "More Than a Feeling" by Boston, because that's what they were trying to play when they wrote it.
Yep, I know that story. That story is well documented. I think that's so cool too. That connection from the '70s to the '90s. A band who best exemplified the transition from 80s glam metal to 90s grunge in one package really was Mother Love Bone. They're the Seattle breakout story. Can you talk about that band, how it led to the formation of Pearl Jam as well?
It's a very long and convoluted story, but Mother Love Bone were basically a glam metal band, almost a hair metal band, but they didn't quite get the hair right and they didn't quite get the glam right. So, you know, in the way that failure always happens, they created something completely new for themselves. And they were beginning to get press nationwide. They were beginning to get noticed. They had a record deal. Then Andrew Wood, the singer, died. And I mean, the band just obviously, you know, the band ended. The album came out a few months later and nobody really paid attention. But everybody who was in Mother Love Bone pretty much went on to another group, and Pearl Jam were the great beneficiaries. And Pearl Jam were a funny group because I was never a Pearl Jam fan.
No.
Early on, I saw them, and it was like, yeah, they're just really a rock band with not great songs. And whenever I think of Pearl Jam now, I think of Adam Sandler on Saturday Night Live doing his version of whatever their first hit was.
Is it Even Flow?
Yabby, yabby.
Opera Man. Was it Opera Man?
Opera Man, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, never a Pearl Jam fan, but I did like Mother Love Bone. I never saw them. So it all fell apart just before I got there.
Yeah, he died of an overdose, Andrew Wood, 1990.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard people played me tapes, and I mean they were a great band. And would they have been the breakout band? It's hard to say because they were still visually something of a sort of a flashback to the, you know, what's happened in the late 80s. Whereas the groups that did make it, they were the utter antithesis of sort of glam metal and hair metal and everything. You know, you just looked at them and it's like, okay.
Yeah, well, Andrew Wood had that Enough is Enough look. Remember Enough's Enough, right? The glam metal band, and sorry to put a label on a band again. Here we go, right? Glam metal, but yeah, he had that look about him. Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard were the two members of Mother Love Bone that went on to form Pearl Jam.
Yes.
Yep. Jeff Ament, the bassist, Stone Gossard, the guitarist. Yeah, they went on to form Pearl Jam. Yeah,
I mean, the other great band very early on was Shadow, which was Mike McCready and Chris and Rick Friel. And yeah, again, they'd gone before I got there, but hearing tapes, it's like, you know, they also had that same glam metal into something else feel to them.
Yeah, Stone Gossard, a big UFO fan.
Yes. Yeah, UFO were great.
Yes. Very underrated. Just never had a huge hit single.
No.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Some of the popular Seattle venues of the time are included in this book. So most of them, okay. So I wanted to go through some of these places in just a word or two on each. Let's start with the Vogue. Nirvana they played their first proper show there. You write that it was a dark room with dark corners, an ear-splitting sound system, and a far-sighted booking policy. Almost any week, another star in waiting was on the bill?
Yeah. I mean, Smashing Pumpkins played there, Afghan Wigs. But then, you know, there was also a lot of just, I wonder who that is. They're at the Vogue. I think I'll go. And the Vogue, as I said, is the one that was haunted by the girls who worked there during one of the venue's past incarnations. And I mean, it was so atmospheric. You walked in, you did this little left into the dance floor, and it always felt dark and warm. It's just a really comfortable, lovely venue. Very old. I think it was built after the fire, which was at the end of the 19th century, and it's still there. It's now a hairdresser.
It's a hairdresser. I was going to ask if have any of these paranormal TV shows, have they gone there to look into this haunting?
I wouldn't know.
I
tend not to watch those. If they haven't, they should.
They should. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Central Tavern, Wayne Flower, drummer with a band called Tree People, said loading the instruments was like anything he had ever seen. This is from Wayne Flower, as it was about 4.5 feet off of the ground.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. When normally they were at most a couple feet up. So, and then there was these stairs he had to walk up to get the equipment in. This sounded like a real pain in the ass to get your equipment into this place.
Yeah. Thankfully, I never had to do that. And the Central Tavern, I mean, again, it was one of the older buildings that had been repurposed many times over the years. And that was, I think, that was something else I loved there, that a lot of the venues had a history. That they had not always been, a club. They'd been, different things. They'd been warehouses. They'd been offices. They'd been shop fronts. But they were old, to the point where you go to a place like Rock Candy, which was a new build, the early 90s, and it was like, well, it had been a garage, but it was, it was relatively new, and it was like, this is horrible. This is completely soulless and characterless.
It was old in a good way, in a quaint way, in a real rock and roll way. The Showbox had a peculiar dance floor that became a prime attraction.
Yes, it was sprung, and back in the 30s, 40s, I think, there was a brothel-like operation working out of the basement. So the girls would go upstairs and they would find men to dance with and take advantage of the bouncy floor to get the men in the mood.
That is wild. So it just bounced up and down.
Yeah.
A magnificent spectacle, the Paramount Theater. The Seattle Times wrote around the time it opened in the late 20s, early 30s, writing, "Never has such a magnificent cathedral of entertainment been given over to the public."
Yeah, the Paramount was halfway up a hill. When they built it, they had to fill in a gulch because it was like hill, and they had to fill in between two hills in order to build the theater. But it's just a typical, beautiful 1920s provincial theater that they spent a lot of money carving, designing, furnishing, and it still retains that. Great place for shows, and I don't often say that about theaters.
And the last one I have here is the Lake Union Pub. Key to the period punk scenes, $1 to get in, dollar beers.
Yeah. And yeah, that's where the punk bands played. It was on Lake Union, as you can imagine. Newer building, but the audiences kind of made up for it. Had a very, very loyal following, that venue. You'd see the same people there every time you went. And often the same musicians, just in different bands.
That was kind of like the CBGBs of Seattle?
I wouldn't give it that high a rating.
Okay.
It was more like the place down the road from CBGBs that the support bands usually play.
Okay.
Nobody really of note came out of it. And when I say of note, I'd say that the average person outside of Seattle was aware of. And there were terrific bands. I mean, Knee Jerk Homeboy were really good. Kent 3 were great. I mean, there were so many bands that you'd see there. You'd never hear of them again. But it's like, that was a really fun 30 minutes.
And we can't go without talking about the Sub Pop label. You're right that this began as a record review column in The Rocket. And you added that, quote, "It's safe to state that without a local Seattle newspaper called The Rocket, there would be no Seattle scene and no grunge." Can you talk about The Rocket and then how it led to the Sub Pop label?
Well, I mean, the two are separate. Sub Pop did start as a review column, but it very quickly went off in its own direction. But the Rocket was important because you need media, a print, or you did need a print medium that people could sit down with when they weren't in a club and read through and find bands that they thought they might like and who's playing next. And every city, it seems, has something or other, but the Rocket went out of its way to look like a real music paper, not magazine. It was newsprint. It was a lot like the ones that were sort of huge and so instrumental in Britain in the 70s and 80s. You'd pick it up, but it was free, which was nice. So you'd pick it up and you'd go through, and they would interview local artists, and real interviews, not just the press release recycled, which a lot do. And I mean, other cities had these, but the Rocket had an attitude, and a lot of that was down to the editor, Grant Alden. He really was, a national magazine editor slumming it in Seattle is the only way I can describe him. He should have been at Rolling Stone or Cream or somewhere, controlling their musical content. But, he was in Seattle, and he was one of the best editors I've ever worked for, because he knew what he wanted the paper to be like. You'd go in and say, "Hi, can I review such and such a band?" He'd say, No, you should do this one instead. And usually he was right.
And it lasted till 2000. Launched in 79. Its last issue was in 2000.
Yeah, it changed a lot over the years. I mean, I stopped reading it when I stopped writing for it, which was probably around 95, 96. And it was already changing. It was paying, because by that time there wasn't so much of a local scene. So it was paying more attention to visiting artists again than the local bands. Because, I mean, one thing that was very strange was 94, Cobain died in 94, and you really did feel there were no new Seattle bands coming up playing, let's use a very general label, of rock and roll. It was almost as though the influx of tech companies and the computer age hit Seattle bands before it hit a lot of places, which is understandable when you think a lot of the people working, living in town now were working for Microsoft, Real Networks, whoever. But that changed the scene, and that's pretty much why the book ends in 94, because suddenly there was no more continuity between bands. There was instead dance music was coming up, industrial was moving more towards the surface, and Prodigy were big. It was like we moved away from guitars and noise, and it became very dance oriented, and really wasn't as much fun.
Yeah, and that music that the bands like Nirvana made was now being packaged as a commercial entity. It was,
yeah. It had ascended into that realm of, well, it was golden oldies by that time. You think, Nevermind came out in 91. By 95, I mean, it was old, because time moved differently in those days. So you'd hear, Smells Like Teen Spirit, and it's a blast from the past. And it's like, damn, I still remember the first time I heard that.
Even some of those bands changed their sound, like Pearl Jam. Pearl Jam didn't sound like they did in the early 90s. Their sound started to change with Vitalogy.
Yeah, which was probably smart of them. I mean, they, more than anyone else, I think they really did try to get rid of the grunge thing. I'm not convinced they had a better replacement. But yeah, I mean, they changed. They got bigger and bigger and bigger. And, good for them. I mean, it's tragic when you think about it. And I go into this at the end of the book, that really Pearl Jam are the only survivors of all the bands that we watched rise so high. Pearl Jam are the only ones that are left.
Isn't that sad? Yeah. They're the last man standing. Eddie Vedder is the last of all of those frontmen from his era are gone.
Yeah, which is a really tasteless observation, but it's so true. It's like Ringo Starr is now the last man standing of the great British beat drummers. of the 60s.
Yeah, rest in peace, Charlie Watts.
Yeah. And it still baffles me that Pearl Jam became so big, but I think they played the game, they enjoyed the game, and they actually reached a position where they could start dictating how they played the game.
And they weren't chasing the mainstream. They were
No.
catering to their fans. They took that Grateful Dead approach, different set list every night. You come tonight, you really should pay for a ticket to come back tomorrow night because we're not going to play the same set list.
And I think they were also fortunate in a way in that they were not reliant on the media in the same way. Again, Nirvana were not reliant on the media, but the media was reliant on Nirvana. So Nirvana would bring out a new album and it would get, a 20-page review where, the writer went into every note on the record and what was wrong with it. Whereas Pearl Jam, it's just, there's a new Pearl Jam album. It sounds like the last one. Eddie Vedder goes, yeah. And that would be it. So Pearl Jam could just build their audience without having to worry, is alternative press going to like this one? Probably not. Whereas I think Nirvana's people wanted good press. Pearl Jam might have complained at the time, all our reviews are bad. Why do people hate us? But it worked in their favor. It gave them longevity. Other groups, the press, the press liked them, and it didn't help.
And difference between Pearl Jam and Nirvana would be Pearl Jam, their first album was with a major label. They were Epic Records right from the start. Nirvana starts off with Sub Pop. Sub Pop released their very first single, Love Buzz. Talk about Sub Pop's importance to the Seattle grunge scene. Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman launched Sub Pop in 1986, I believe is the year.
Yeah, and it was never, the funny thing about Sub Pop is it was never a Seattle-centric label. They released, records by Seattle bands, but they also released a lot of bands, from elsewhere. First Sub Pop band I ever interviewed was Big Chief, who were from Ann Arbor. And I think the second was Billy Childish, who was actually from the town that I grew up in England. So, they were never about Seattle and never about grunge, but they were in a position where they could give us the impression that they were. One of my favorite stories about Sub Pop's relationship with Seattle groups was there was a BBC documentary team in town just filming grunge, and they were going around the clubs and filming, and they saw this band called Sick and Wrong, who were absolutely fabulous. They were somewhat tongue-in-cheek, very outrageous, just did bizarre things on stage. They threw nachos around. The lead singer, Wendy, was Mr. Wendy, and she had like this enormous dildo hanging down, which she would offer to members of the audience to do things with.
First time you saw them, your jaw dropped.
Yeah, but you stayed back from the stage just in case she noticed your mouth was open. They were a fantastic band. I loved them, and the BBC crew was just blown away by them. And the next day, they were in the Sub Pop offices, talking to either Bruce or Jonathan about, so you're signing all these bands. Why have you not signed Sick and Wrong? And a couple of months later, a Sick and Wrong single came out on Sub Pop. Wow. So they weren't deliberately keeping a finger on the pulse of what was happening. They were looking further afield. And as you go through the book, you'll see by 94 they were releasing singles by Britpop bands. Not necessarily because they thought Britpop was going to be the next big thing in Seattle, but because they were great records by bands who just didn't happen to be from Seattle. Elastica, Gene, and Supergrass.
And Sub Pop is still around?
Yes.
They're still an active label.
They're still an active label. I haven't heard anything new on Sub Pop for so long. But yeah, they're still putting out stuff, and I still hear good things about it.
And they lost Nirvana to Geffen Records when that happened, they collected $75,000 plus a 2% royalty on Nirvana's next two albums. I'm sure they were bummed to lose Nirvana, but they couldn't have been surprised that a major label would grab them up. Or were they?
I guess not. I mean, Sub Pop, I don't think ever intended to be a band's label for life. They intended to, pick up the bands they liked, nurture them through whatever nurturing was required, and then wave goodbye when a big label came in for them, which is, I think, what independent labels should do. A lot of indies will, they'll have a breakthrough artist, they'll sign them to some sort of deal that there's no way they can live up to. And it brings down band and label. Sub Pop was smart. It's like, if they knew someone was going to break, then, get what we can for them, but, keep it amicable.
Do you think Kurt, in retrospect, would have felt he and the band would have been better off staying on Sub Pop, knowing what was to come with the pressures of fame?
It's hard to say. It would have brought different pressures. Would Sub Pop have had the ability to press however many copies of the Teen Spirit single and Nevermind that the market was demanding? Or would everything have been on back order for years and the momentum would have died and Nirvana would have broken up with a great indie, two great indie albums under their belt? You have to look at it. You have to look at it from a business point of view. Or would Nirvana have said, we'll stay with you, but you have to give us the same amount of money as Geffen? So Sub Pop would have had to mortgage absolutely everything and rob a few banks. Yeah, that's one of those unanswerable questions.
Alice in Chains were thought to be the first to break out of Seattle in a big way. I just recently heard an interview with the guitarist of Warrant who said that Janie Lane of Warrant was a fan of Alice in Chains. He said they would drive around and Janie Lane would say, you got to hear this band. It's interesting to hear those glam bands, those hair metal bands, that they were fans of this music. They did start Alice in Chains did start as a glam metal band under the name of Sleaze.
Yeah. And I mean, Alice were another of those bands that they kind of crossed over, but very quickly found their direction was going, very different to the hair metal or just metal bands.
You know what's interesting with Alice in Chains? They opened for Van Halen in 1991.
Yeah. I was never a big. I suppose when I look back, I wasn't really a fan of grunge or what was being termed grunge. I liked Nirvana well enough. Didn't mind Soundgarden, Alice and Pearl Jam, and then some of the lesser bands, and then the ones that came from elsewhere. Never a fan. In a way, it was disappointing that grunge was the musical scene to break out of Seattle.
Well, Soundgarden was one of those bands people didn't even realize how long they had been around. They formed in 1984. Singer Chris Cornell was gigging around town with what you described as a glam metal light band called Shemps.
That's right. I mean, that was the thing. Grunge did not come out of nowhere. I mean, the musicians had, as the cliche goes, paid their dues. Even Nirvana had been around for, 3 or 4 years before anybody really became aware of them. So, everyone had, gone through their version of the 80s, playing their version of 80s music. And it was just another of those sort of wonderful moments of synchronicity where they all started heading in a similar direction with enough difference to tell them apart, of course, but a similar musical direction around the same time. And there was a lot of, I'm not sure if friendship is exactly the term, but musicians in town all knew one another and would, they would swap ideas, whether deliberately or otherwise. They would hear what each other were doing and think, oh, we could use something like that.
I was going to ask you about that because from all the articles I've read and documentaries I've seen, there wasn't this competitiveness as much as it was they were all on the same team.
Yeah. And once fame came along, of course, Kurt Cobain would be rude about Pearl Jam and Pearl Jam would be rude about, whoever. But
that was done for the media because, there has to be a rivalry amongst top bands. Look, Oasis and Blur, Beatles and Stones. That sort of thing is important from a media point of view. But
Sure.
really, they, as I say, they may not have all hung out together and, had a grunge superstars only club, but they knew one another. They talked, they went to see one another, particularly in the early days. And they were all, they're all based in Seattle, and Seattle had this ability to shape things.
I think of the movie Singles. Is that a good depiction, or was that was just overblown?
It wasn't even overblown. I think. The idea of Singles, Cameron Crowe wanted to do, the movie about this group of friends and set it in Seattle. And whenever I've watched it like once all the way through, and then tried again a couple of times, including once while I was doing the book. And I don't really see why people say this movie epitomizes Seattle at the time. Because beyond showing, a few venues and a few local musicians and people, it could have been set anywhere. They could have set it in Colorado Springs, except we didn't have as many clubs or musicians. It could have been anywhere. So I don't rate Singles as, if somebody is just starting out trying to sort of re-experience Seattle, I put Singles very low down on the list of essential texts, sadly.
I say get your book and read your book.
Oh, thank you.
I
would agree actually. And then
cheap plug. I don't care. You're my guest. I'll give it a cheap plug.
Pick up Peter Bagg's Hate comic.
Okay. It's a comic book.
Yeah.
Okay.
Comic book Hate. They've just brought out this sort of wonderful boxed everything, every issue, every piece of artwork. But you read through, and I talk about it quite a few times in the Grunge Diaries. It really is. This is what Seattle was like. Buddy Bradley's trail through the city, because it's set in Seattle. He goes to the places, he sees the bands, and Peter made up some great bands in there that he made up, but they were all based on sort of real things. Sick and Wrong, in fact, who I mentioned earlier, were one of the inspirations behind a group called Leonard and the Love Gods.
Leonard and the Love Gods.
Leonard and the Love Gods, the best Seattle band you've never heard of unless you read Hate. But, talking of bands that no one's ever heard of, at the end, I sort of get a little self-indulgent, and it's like, these are the bands that meant the most to me in Seattle at the time. And looking through that list and playing through the records that they made, or at least that I have, it's like the explosion of creativity and energy is one thing that everybody knows, but the sheer diversity of bands. You would not go to see Quiverpuss and expect them to sound like Sky Cries Mary. You wouldn't go and see Hovercraft and expect them to sound like Knee Jerk Homeboy. It's like there was so much going on and so many different scenes which, had the stars been aligned in a certain, in a different way, they could have been the ones that broke out.
So still some bands yet to discover from that era?
Oh, definitely. I have this box. It was really funny. I had a huge collection of Seattle stuff. And, over the years, it's like, well, I'm never going to play these again. And I was like selling them on eBay and things. And I knew that there was a whole bunch that didn't sell. And I put them somewhere. When we moved from Seattle out here, they just vanished. So I just assumed, I'd lost them, given them away, thrown them away or something. And one day I was digging around in the basement and I found this little box and I opened it up and there was like 200 singles.
Wow.
From the time. And of course, the ones that sold were the ones you'd expect to sell. Everybody bought, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Mudhoney, they'd all gone. I was left with the bands that no one outside Seattle had heard of, and they all were like the bands that I'd really liked at the time.
Well, let me ask you this, because I was going to wrap it up. I got just maybe 2-3 more questions left. But before we get to that, now that you're saying that, is there one band from that era that didn't make it that really stands out that people should look into? Any particular band? Tad was a band that was well known there that didn't really go on, but they did okay. But is there a band that just really nobody knows about unless you were actually there at that time in Seattle that should have gotten big?
A tricky question, because as I say, there was so many bands and such diversity between them. If you're looking for somebody good and noisy and fun, I would say Sick and Wrong.
Sick and Wrong. Okay.
They were the ones that Sub Pop hadn't signed until the BBC asked why, with Mr. Wendy. They did 2 or 3 singles and a CD, and they were fabulous. Sky Cries Mary, who were almost like a prog rock Pink Floyd Hawkwindy band, but very sort of rave tribal influenced. Yeah, they were fantastic. They had light show, they wore costumes, and they just played these long 10-minute spacey things. Had male-female vocals. Anissa was operatically trained. Roderick wasn't. And it was like this wonderful clash between the most pure female vocal and Roderick almost sort of mumbling. And they harmonized this. Sensational band. The Gits, who were the ultimate, I think, the great Seattle punk band. Their lead singer, Amir Zapata, was murdered year before Cobain died. And
really?
I say in the book, that was the moment that ended Seattle as a musical force, because she was walking home from a club and was attacked and killed. And it's like suddenly they never found who. Well, it wasn't. When did they find her killer? It was like 2000 and something. It was years before they found the killer, and it turned out to have just been a drifter from Florida who just happened to be in Seattle and happened to kill somebody. But it really sort of put the frighteners on people. I think it's like walking home from clubs no longer seemed a good idea.
End of the innocence.
Yeah, very, very much. But the Gits were a sensational band, and everybody should hear the Gits. Another one, if you like sort of long instrumentals that don't go anywhere for hours, Hovercraft, which was Vedder's first wife, Beth. It was her band, and Eddie actually played drums on a couple of their records and also at some live shows. And the English press in particular, Hovercraft, Eddie Vedder's new band. And it just made me laugh so much to think of Pearl Jam fans running out to hear Hovercraft and just getting these insane instrumentals. I mean, really, really spacey. They made Sky Cries Mary sound like the Sex Pistols.
And this is back in early 90s, mid 90s?
Yeah. These are all bands that fall into the catchment area of the book, which is 90 to 94.
Yep.
There's so many, I think, someone reads through the book and just says, oh, that sounds interesting. Hunt them out. Look for the Quiverpuss single. They were a goth band who were as good as their name.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Let's get to the end of your book, because this is fascinating to me. You include, towards the end of the book, an interview conducted with Nirvana, July 16th, 1993. So you met him, you met bassist Chris Novoselic and drummer Dave Grohl. You write it as Chris without the T. Is it Chris or Chris?
Oh, who knows? His name changed every single time written down.
It's an interesting name, Krist.
I think what I did in the end was I just sort of went through all the press cuttings I'd got and found the one that was the most consistent.
And it's Chris without the T?
Yeah.
Okay, good to know. So you met the band at a downtown Seattle hotel, made your way to a restaurant Kurt chose on Capitol Hill called Eileen's. And there's a real candid moment involving Kurt and Chris. Kurt left for a bit, eventually came back. Chris took off, assuming Kurt wouldn't come back. And this is in that period where these guys were really concerned with Kurt and his drug addiction. Can you talk about that and what was going through your mind at that moment?
A lot less than was going through their publicist's mind. So yeah, we got to Eileen's, we got a table, we ordered. And then Kurt was like, hold on, I've just got to run out for a moment. And it's like, off he trots. And time goes by, his dinner's sitting there, his dinner gets cold, we've eaten ours, we've moved on to the coffee, we've moved on to the beers, and we're still sitting there. And Chris was getting more and more agitated. Like, where is he? Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? No Kurt, no Kurt, no Kurt. And finally it's like, I can't, yeah, I'm going home. I'm not waiting around for him. And so Dave and I ended up, we weren't really doing the interview, we were just nattering. We were talking about his collection of antique clocks. Which it's always stuck in my mind. And then Kurt just sort of wanders in, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. Sorry about that, I had to go see my chiropractor. Meanwhile, the publicist had spent the last hour, 2 hours, I don't even know how long it was, really just sitting there with his head in his hands. And when Chris went, it's like this poor guy, it's like he wanted to resign and run away and live in the South Seas. But Kirk and I had to go see my chiropractor. Where's Chris? Chris left. It's like Chris, it's like, Kurt this, Kurt that. And yeah, I mean, I guess you could call it candid at the time. It was quite funny. And then we sat down and, just had a sort of a wonderful conversation. So the pertinent bits are included in the book.
Yeah, he says, fucking Cobain, the junkie pissing off the score. That's what...
Yes, is what Chris, he assumed Chris thought, and he's probably correct.
That's what Kurt assumed Chris thought, yeah.
Yeah, and probably that's what Kurt did. But, he came back, he was very perky, he was, very, very chatty. And, as you'll see, we had a great interview. And, I didn't put in stuff where we were just sort of nattering about other things. Because, sort of a good interview, I think, is more of a conversation, which is great at the time because you just sort of ramble off on different subjects that are of no interest to anybody else and then pull yourselves back. But, yeah, it was really good. Some of it went into alternative press at the time, and then other bits have turned up in other things I've written. But I thought it'd be nice to dig out my original transcript. Insanely, I didn't keep the original cassette. I don't know why.
Oh.
It's 2 hours of just rambling, 3 hours of rambling. But I had my original transcript. So it's like, okay, let's stick this at the end of the book. I don't think it's ever been read in full. So, yeah.
Where were you when you got the news Kurt was gone, and what's the first thing that went through your mind?
I was asleep.
Yeah.
I know, it's like, I was asleep and the phone rang, and I ignored it, and then the phone rang again, and I ignored it, and my wife was like, who keeps phoning us? So, stamp out of bed, and it's... Jason, the editor at Alternative Press, saying, it looks like Kurt Cobain's dead. Find out what happened. What? And it was the maddest weekend. I don't even remember the weekend in detail. I put in as much as I can in the book, but it's like on the phone calling people, trying to find out what happened. And then later in the day... And then calls coming in from magazines in the UK and in the US saying, right, you're in Seattle, find out what happened. So running around the city, nobody who knew him and was sort of involved wanted to talk, because it hadn't been confirmed it was him until much later in the day. But then somebody called and said, get out to the house. Apparently there's, a gathering. So we drove down to Kurt's house, and fans were beginning to gather in the park. And this was still before his death had been officially announced. They were gathering in the park, and it was so surreal. And the Sub Pop party was that weekend. So the city was full of out-of-town journalists, record company people. And it's like, are they going to even hold the party? And they did. And it was just such a strange weekend.
Surreal, like a blur.
Yeah.
Wasn't it a Seattle station that broke it first? I think the electrician who saw the body called his boss and said, I think there's a dead body in the garage. Yeah. Boss called one of the radio stations and they didn't believe him. Then he called the police and he called the station back. I think this is how it went. And then the station called the police and got confirmation. And so they broke it, body in Kurt Cobain's garage. And it just grew from there. Yeah. Were you ever asked to look into the whole conspiracy theories with Courtney Love being responsible? Were you ever assigned anything like that?
I'm sure I was asked, but I didn't.
Yeah.
That whole side of it just didn't interest me. It seemed insane that Courtney would have been involved. And there was a guy named, I can't remember his name, it's in the book. He actually had a series on local access cable that ran for years and years called Who Killed Kurt Cobain? And he went down every rabbit hole you could think of and then bred more rabbits to make new rabbit holes that he could go down. You couldn't watch it every week, but every time you put it on, it was just more and more bizarre. I hope the tapes still exist and that one day someone will put them up on YouTube so you could just sit and watch the whole thing, maybe with some judicious editing. But no, I never. Pop star dies, there are conspiracies. I'd seen it with Elvis, I'd seen it with Mark Bolan, seen it with Ian Curtis,
Jim Morrison,
Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix. It's like.
Yeah, the Hendrix one. Yeah, speaking of Seattle, right? He's from the Seattle area. Yeah, that was the one that his manager had mob ties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People don't want to accept that stars are prone to accidents or accidental deaths. There's always got to be some sinister reason. And, it's natural. It happens every time a big name goes. It happened with Marilyn Monroe. It happened with Rudolph Valentino. So it's natural, but the Kurt one, it took on a very nasty edge because it went after family, very publicly went after family. It wasn't rumor. This was being printed as, almost fact. A lot of people made a lot of money out of really, dragging Courtney's name through the dirt and accusing her of this very heinous act. And, regardless of one's feelings about Courtney as a personality, she didn't deserve that.
Nobody wants to believe that somebody that iconic can die that way. They just don't want it to be that way. They want it to be something more dramatic and sinister or dramatic, or they're not really dead. Tupac's not gone. He's sang about Machiavelli, so he's not really dead. He's still alive.
Yeah, he's on that desert island with Elvis and Jim Morrison.
Right. Elvis is still alive. Yeah. Yeah, Michael Jackson is another one.
Yeah. Even when Mia was murdered, the idea that it was just a complete stranger didn't really cross people's minds. It was, was it her boyfriend? Was it, was it the Gothic community?
Sure.
Because this was just at that period when Goths were being noticed and considered very, very sinister.
Nobody wants to believe a lunatic loner like Lee Harvey Oswald would shoot this man who was
Yeah.
the greatest president of all time. It's impossible for it to be that way. It has to be something bigger.
There has to be more. Yeah. So even with Mia, we saw it, but with Kurt, it just went into like the twilight zone. So yeah, I just steered clear of it.
What do you think Kurt would have done musically if he had lived? What would have become of Nirvana? Do you think he would have gone solo?
I think eventually he would have had to. Nirvana was too limiting in a way. I mean, he showed with the Unplugged concept that, you know, he was thinking sort of bigger and wider. And, you know, at the same time, you had Dave Grohl, who it was obvious that, you know, he was a musical talent beyond being a drummer. You know, he could sing, he could write songs. Would he have wanted to carry on being a drummer forever? Or would he have wanted to break out on his own? Chris had political leanings long before, you know, Nirvana, long before Kurt died. Chances are he would have wanted to get out of music full time and work more towards something that he was passionate about. So I think, yeah, Nirvana would have broken up probably sooner rather than later. And Kurt would have gone solo and probably had it's hard to say what sort of career he would have had. You know, would his songwriting have developed in a way that people still loved? Or would it have been one of those poor sods who leaves a band and everyone say, well, you're not as good as when you were in the group?
Hate to say it, but I think that's what would have happened.
Yeah. I mean, it's very unhealthy to look at musicians who died early and wonder what they would have gone on to, because you just assume they would have kept on getting better and better and better and they'd all have been the new Beatles. But then you look at musicians who didn't die at the peak of their career and how their careers went downwards. So the Dead are the exception.
Yep.
They're the ones who would have kept getting better. So, yeah, I think Paul would have ended up, I think Kurt would have ended up in a Paul McCartney or even a John Lennon after Imagine, but before he was killed position, where he puts out albums and the fans still buy them, but the majority of people may pick up the single.
But I think Kurt would have loved it that way. I think he would have been more comfortable that way. It's like, fine.
Oh, definitely.
Let the fair weather fans be gone.
Yep.
I'll play to 300, 400, 500 people in a nice little club.
He could probably play to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, but there wouldn't have been the mania. I mean, the quote from him, and I'm not going to get it 100% right, was, it was like waking up in the morning and finding out somebody has just thrown petrol bombs onto your bed. You know, stardom. Because their handlers did not handle it very well. They allowed the media to go way over the top. I mean, Kurt and Courtney were being treated in the same way as like a very sort of evil Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. They were not on that level of fame. But when the tabloids are putting you on the cover, you know, the supermarket tabloids, you've stepped beyond anything that a pop star could expect and into this whole realm of just Hollywood insanity. And the label should have stopped that from happening. I don't know how, but, you know, it never happened to anyone else. So they should have somehow found a way of stopping it. And they didn't. They just let it go.
And it got out of control.
Totally.
Last question. Yep. What will you remember most about the Seattle music scene from 1990 to 1994?
Mr. Wendy. Just that it was a really exciting time to be somewhere. Yeah, I mean, for me, it really was, you know, right place, right time. I'd not been overly excited by music en masse in about 10, 12 years at that point. You know, because I came out of the London punk scene, sort of saw that fall apart through the 80s. There were a few good things, but then, you know, around 83, 84, effectively music stopped. And then, I wash up in this city and going out, and it was like being 17 again, and just so many bands, so many clubs, so much excitement, and then seeing it, explode at the end again. But I guess that's what it had to do. So, it's just the sheer excitement of being in what was a wonderful city at a terrific time. And I hope that sort of enthusiasm and excitement comes over in the book.
It certainly does. It brought me back to that time. And this is in Connecticut, many, many miles away from Seattle, but it was happening. I'm in college in New Haven, and that movement, I was right there. As my life was shifting from high school to college years, living in the dorms, there was this shift inside. And just reading your book just brought me back to those times in New Haven, going to the clubs there, and just hearing my friends say, "Have you heard this? Have you seen this? This is Pearl Jam's 10, or this is Nirvana. Have you heard of these guys?" I had a roommate who was a huge alternative fan. He loved Jane's Addiction. He loved all that stuff. And he had Nevermind before it blew up.
Good. And what I would say is, when you get the chance, go onto YouTube and start looking up some of the bands that I talk about that you've not heard of, and just see what you think.
Yeah, it's more important now than ever. Keep the legacy alive with that genre, that era, and especially the bands that didn't get a chance first time around. Give them a chance now.
Yep. Go out and listen to Jessamine. They were amazing.
Yeah. The Grunge Diaries, Seattle, 1990 to 1994. Due out on Backbeat Books, September 15. Any website you want to direct people to get a copy of the book specifically? I always put I'll put the Backbeat Books link up there on our show notes page, but anywhere else? Or do you have your own website, social media pages?
I don't. I think I've got a Dave Thompson Books page on Facebook. That's about it. I would say pester your local shop to bring copies in, or your local library. It should be available everywhere.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I always put a link to search for the local independent bookstore in the area, because they support you, the author, but they're also supporting that local bookstore.
Oh, and one last band that I have to mention, The Wasters.
The Wasters from Seattle?
Yep, there is the drummer from Sky Cries Mary, the bass player from Knee Jerk Homeboy, a gentleman dressed as a gorilla, half a dozen backing singers. It was just like this conglomerate of artists and musicians. And they did a wonderful single whose name I can never remember, but the chorus was "I kick ass in this dress." I think it's called The Thrill. Play it, fall in love with it. It will become your anthem. And you can read all about them in the book.
You bet. September 15, it's out. Dave, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you very much. This has been really fun.
Thanks to Dave Thompson for taking us through his book, The Grunge Diaries, Seattle, 1990 to 1994. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just the author, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore on our show notes page. And be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. And if you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.